The night of March 15th, 1945, brought a moon so bright over eastern Germany that every shadow seemed alive with danger, and somewhere in the frozen landscape between the prison camp and freedom, a young black woman ran through snow that reached her knees, her lungs burning with cold air and her heart pounding with a terror. She had learned to transform into fuel, and her name was Lucille Carter, and she was an American Red Cross volunteer who had already escaped from German captivity once before, and been recaptured and beaten and thrown into solitary confinement, and now she was running again, because she understood something that her captors never could, which was that the human spirit cannot be caged by wire or walls, or fear when it has decided to be free. She had been born in 1920 in Detroit, Michigan, in a neighborhood where black families had migrated from the South, seeking opportunity and finding instead a different kind of discrimination that was no less painful for being Northern, and her father had worked in the automobile factories, and her mother had cleaned houses for white families, and they had taught their daughter that education was the only path to a better life, and Lucille had excelled in school, earning a nursing degree from a black college in Tennessee, and when the war came, she had volunteered immediately because she believed that serving her country might finally prove that black Americans deserved the same rights as everyone else. The Red Cross had been reluctant to send black women overseas, but the desperate need for personnel had overcome their hesitation, and Lucille had been assigned to a hospital unit supporting the Allied advance through France in the summer of 1944, and she had worked 18-hour shifts treating wounds that turned her stomach and holding the hands of dying boys who called her mama in their final moments. And she had discovered within herself a strength she had not known she possessed, and she had earned the respect of everyone who worked alongside her regardless of their prejudices. But what happened next changed everything, because in December of 1944, during the chaos of the German that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Lucille's hospital unit was overrun by advancing German forces, and she was captured along with several other medical personnel, and they were loaded into trucks and transported east into Germany, and she watched through the canvas covering as the world she knew disappeared behind her, and a new reality of barbed wire and guard towers and the constant presence of death took its place. The prisoner camp where she was held was not designed for medical personnel, and it was a makeshift facility that held a mixture of captured soldiers and civilians, and the conditions were brutal, with inadequate food and no heat, and guards who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of their prisoners. And Lucille was the only black woman in the camp, and the German guards treated her with particular cruelty because the Nazi ideology viewed people of African descent as subhuman, and she endured insults and beatings and isolation that would have broken many people, but she refused to let them see her cry. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because among her fellow prisoners was a Polish resistance fighter named who had been captured while smuggling weapons to partisans, and who had escaped from 3 different camps before being recaptured, and who looked at Lucille with eyes that held no prejudice, only a calculating assessment of whether this American woman had what it took to survive. And Katarzyna began to teach Lucille the skills that would save her life, and the education that happened in whispered conversations and stolen moments would prove more valuable than anything she had learned in school. The first escape attempt came in January of 1945, when the winter cold was so intense that the guards preferred to stay in their heated quarters, and Katarzyna had identified a weak point in the fence, where the wire had been damaged by a fallen tree, and she had obtained wire cutters from a contact within the camp, and on a night when clouds covered the moon, Lucille and Katarzyna and 2 other prisoners crawled through the snow toward freedom, and the cold bit into their flesh and the fear coiled in their stomachs, but they kept moving because stopping meant death. And then something no one expected happened, because they made it through the fence and into the forest beyond in 4 or 3 days. They traveled west toward the Allied lines, surviving on bark and snow and the occasional kindness of Polish farmers who risked their lives to help them. And Lucille's feet developed frostbite, and every step was agony, but she refused to slow down, and Katarzyna pushed them harder, saying that the Germans would be searching, and that every hour of delay increased their danger, and they were so close to freedom that Lucille could taste it. The recapture happened on the 4th day, when a German patrol stumbled upon them while they were resting in an abandoned barn. And there was no warning, just a sudden appearance of soldiers with rifles and the barking of dogs, and Katarzyna tried to fight and was shot and killed. And Lucille watched her friend die, and something inside her shattered and reformed into something harder and more determined, and she was dragged back to the camp and beaten and thrown into a concrete cell where she spent 2 weeks in darkness with only bread and water and the memory of Katarzyna's sacrifice to sustain her. Behind these ruins a secret waited because, during her time in solitary confinement, Lucille discovered that the cell had been used by previous prisoners and that someone had scratched a map into the concrete, showing the layout of the camp and the locations of guard posts and the timing of patrols, and she memorized every detail, knowing that this information might be the difference between life and death, and she began to plan her second escape even before she was released from solitary, and the guards thought they had broken her, but they had only made her more dangerous. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of deception, as Lucille pretended to be subdued and compliant, while secretly gathering supplies and making contacts and studying the movements of the guards, and she found allies among the other prisoners, including an American pilot named James, who had been shot down over Germany, and a French nurse named Marie, who had been captured while working with the resistance. And together they formed a new escape committee, and they planned with the precision of a military operation, because they knew they would have only one chance. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because through her contacts, Lucille learned that the war was turning decisively against Germany and that the Allies were advancing from both east and west, and that the camp commandant had received orders to evacuate the prisoners and march them deeper into Germany, where they would be used as bargaining chips or simply killed, and the timeline for escape had suddenly accelerated, and what had been planned for spring would have to happen in the next few days, or not at all. The escape began on the night of March 15th, 1945. And Lucille led a group of 7 prisoners through a tunnel that had been dug over weeks of secret labor, and they emerged beyond the fence in a wooded area, where the guards rarely patrolled and the moon was bright, which was both a blessing and a curse because they could see where they were going, but they could also be seen, and they moved as quickly as stealth allowed, heading west toward the sound of distant artillery that marked the approaching American forces. The journey was a nightmare of fear and exhaustion, and they traveled only at night, hiding during the day in barns and cellars, and once in a grave that had been dug for bodies that never came, and German patrols seemed to be everywhere as the collapsing Reich tried desperately to maintain control, and twice they were nearly discovered, and twice Lucille made decisions that saved their lives, choosing paths that seemed wrong but that avoided the dangers her instincts detected, and the others followed her because she had become their leader through nothing but sheer force of will. The crossing of the Elba River was the most dangerous moment of the entire escape because the bridges were all destroyed or guarded, and they had to find another way, and Lucille remembered something. Katarzyna had told her about rivers freezing in certain places, where the current was slow, and she led them upstream until they found a section where ice had formed, and they tested it carefully and crossed one at a time, their hearts stopping with every crack and groan, and when they reached the far side they were in territory that would soon be liberated, and Lucille allowed herself to hope. The American patrol that found them on March 22nd did not believe their story at first, and Lucille had to explain again and again who she was and how she had gotten there. And the soldiers looked at this black woman in her tattered clothing and her frostbitten hands and her eyes that had seen things they could not imagine, and slowly their skepticism gave way to amazement, and then to a kind of awe, because what she had accomplished was almost impossible, and yet here she was, living proof that the impossible was sometimes exactly what happened. The military intelligence officers who debriefed her were particularly interested in everything she had observed during her captivity, and the location of the camp, and the strength of the garrison, and the condition of the roads, and the morale of the German soldiers, and Lucille provided detailed information that would help in the final push into Germany, and she learned later that her intelligence contributed to operations that saved American lives, and that the escape she had led was studied as an example of successful evasion tactics. The hospital where she recovered was in France, and the doctors who treated her, frostbite and malnutrition, marveled at her survival, and the nurses who had known her before her capture wept when they saw what she had become, and Lucille accepted their tears and their praise with a quietness that some mistook for modesty, but was actually something deeper, and it was the stillness of someone who had walked through the valley of death and emerged on the other side forever changed. The war ended 6 weeks after her escape, and Lucille watched the celebrations with complicated emotions, because she knew that the victory had cost so much, and that so many had not lived to see this day, and she thought of Katarzyna, who had taught her how to survive, and who had given her life, so that others might be free, and she promised herself that she would never forget, and that she would live in a way that honored all those who had fallen. The return to America brought a different kind of struggle, because the country Lucille had served still treated black citizens as second class, and the veterans' benefits that white soldiers received were denied to her, and the recognition that should have been automatic was delayed and minimized, and she discovered that escaping from a German Prison camp was easier than escaping from American racism, and this realization fueled her determination to fight for change. The decades that followed saw Lucille become a leader in the civil rights movement, and she marched and organized and spoke about her experiences, and she told audiences that if she could escape from German captivity twice, then Black Americans could certainly escape from the prison of discrimination in her. Story inspired thousands, and she became a symbol of the courage and resilience that defined the movement. And the young people who heard her speak carried her words into battles she would never see. The recognition she deserved came slowly and then all at once, and in 1985, 40 years after her escape, the Army belatedly awarded her the Bronze Star and the Prisoner of War medal, and in 1992 she was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame for her contributions to the war effort, and in 2000 she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from a nation that had finally begun to reckon with its history. She passed away in 2012 at the age of 92, and the funeral was attended by generals and politicians and civil rights leaders and ordinary people who had been touched by her story, and the flag that draped her coffin was presented to her grandchildren, who had grown up hearing stories of their grandmother's incredible courage, and the nation paused to honor a woman who had refused to accept that any prison could hold her. And so we remember Lucille Carter now running through the snow on that bright March night, her lungs burning and her heart pounding and her spirit absolutely unbreakable, and we remember her learning the art of survival from Katarzyna and whispered conversations, and we remember her memorizing the map scratched into the concrete of her solitary cell, and we remember her leading her fellow prisoners through the tunnel and across the frozen river and into the arms of freedom, and we remember her fighting for civil rights with the same determination she had shown in escaping captivity, and we remember that her story is a story about the human refusal to accept change of any kind, and we remember that she escaped twice, not because she was lucky, but because she decided that freedom was worth any price. And we remember that as long as we tell her story, she will continue to run through the snow and continue to break through the wire and continue to inspire all those who struggle against oppression, and she will stand forever as proof that no prison can hold a soul that has decided to be free.